So welcome to Customize and Extending Web App Builder. My name is David Martinez, and this is my colleague Gavin. And today we're going to talk about customizing and extending, and we'll share a little bit. Did anyone go to the session before Web App Builder? What's new and what's coming at 4 o'clock? Some? Okay. So we'll share some information about what's coming in the future, a little bit of information. So today we're going to talk about. We'll have an introduction to Web App Builder. We'll keep it short and sweet, but I always like to start off with an intro. Gavin's going to talk about creating a widget, right? So we're going to dive into some code. I'm going to dive into some code for themes, mainly CSS. Then we're going to talk about, how do we be successful in this, right? So that's with WAP communities, getting help, seeking answers, asking questions, interacting. Then we're going to talk about what's coming. And then we'll have some questions for Q&A. Fair enough? Okay. All right, so let's get started. Okay, so what is Web App Builder today, right? Well, it's for building web apps for your organization, right? And it uses our JavaScript API. And it actually uses 2 versions. For 2D apps, it uses 3x API. For 3D apps, it uses 4x APIs, right? So if you're programming one and the other, you got to write to that specific API because you can't combine them. But don't worry, we're going to fix that. We'll share those news later with you. But basically, we use our JavaScript API to inherit all those dependencies to build Web App Builder, and we use some of the JavaScript API to build the GUI interface. So you can build widgets, you can build themes, right? You can obviously take source code from other different widgets that may be built in JavaScript and encapsulate those and bring those in. And most importantly, it's a responsive app. So you ain't got to worry about building in a breakpoint at 568 to handle when someone shrinks the screen size. We built in that responsiveness into that. So let's look at building an app, right? And what Web App Builder's made of. So we have a GUI builder, right? And basically that's our builder interface. And then what we do is we call our widgets. Okay, so those are our worker bees, which are functions or logic. And then basically we grab those widgets. We grab a theme. Okay, that theme is a brand of your application. We grab the stem app, right? We grab all those components, and then we store them in this thing called a config file. So the config file is basically everything that makes up that Web App Builder application and references those endpoints for that. And then voila, it's magic. You have an app, right? It's good for rapid application development, good for fast applications where you don't want to have to write code from scratch. So Web App Builder does have a great developing framework to do that. And in fact, it's one of our most popular most popular, I would say, configurable applications, builders. Story map is number 1 as far as sheer volume of what people are creating. But I took this last week. So we have it's like a dashboard that we have internal at Esri, and I can look at how many apps are built with Web App Builder. And this is basically taken I think it was last Wednesday, we had 461,533 apps. Pretty popular, right? Considering we released this a couple years ago, more than a couple, but it's by far very popular. And this is just online. This doesn't include portal. So 33% of these public apps, 38% are private, 15% are shared, and then 14% amongst an account, okay? So it's very popular. And what we're gonna talk about today here is the developer edition. And the reason why is we're all developers, and it's really the developer does the heavy lifting. We do have 3 versions of Web App Builder. One's an online, that's WYSIWYG, right? What you see is what you get. We have an enterprise builder as well for not enterprise builder. We have one for enterprise, right? And that's for widgets and such. And then the one that you can tinker with and get everything done with and do themes and widgets is the Web App Builder division. So I just want to make that clear distinction, and that's what we're going to talk about today. Okay, so at the very core of it, if you're just diving into Web App Builder or you just need a refresher, is you're going to be dealing with widgets and themes, and it's pretty consistent when you're developing with both. For a widget, it executes at runtime. It's configure in, so it doesn't mean that's not copy and paste. It's self-sufficient and distributable, so me and my colleague can share information. We can run multiple, code projects, share widgets, etc. It needs a container. There's no coding block. And best of all, has a programming framework, right, of a container. And the same thing with theme. You're going to see a lot of consistency here. It's applied at runtime. It's configure in, not modified CSS. Needs a container, self-sufficient and distributable, and it has a programming framework, okay? Pretty consistent, so just think about that, because if you develop widgets, you can pretty much develop themes too. And that's kind of what we built it for, is I know that 98%, how many people are developing widgets today? Okay, right. How many are doing themes? A couple, right? So what I'm here today is to talk about is giving you that confidence to develop themes, because what we don't want is, when we created this, we gave you the out-of-box themes, but what happens is we get comfortable and then we create themes, and then you have applications that look the same across many different organizations. But you can take themes and really give it your own brand of what you want it to look like, right? So that's kind of what I wanted to kind of illustrate today. Widgets you could do obviously the same as well. The majority of work's probably going to be widgets, because that's the function logic of your app. Okay, so better yet, as opposed to me talking, let's get into widget development, and then Gavin will hand it back over to me for themes. All right, so you're on 3, Mr. Gavin?
Yep. Great. All right, so so creating a custom widget is what we'll talk about now, which actually uses the same skills that most of us probably in this room already have from building plain JavaScript apps. So right here, I have an example of maybe a typical single-page JavaScript app you might have. You have some CSS at the top, you have some JavaScript in the middle, and an HTML template at the bottom. Well, our concept of Web AppBuilder widgets follow that same pattern. We just separate those sections out into a widget.css file, a JavaScript file, and an HTML file. With Web AppBuilder widgets, you'll be creating Dojo modules that inherit from base widget, which is provided by the Jimu library of Web AppBuilder. So this is similar to how plain Dojo apps, for those of you who are familiar with that, inherit from widget base, which provides the digit lifecycle methods like post create and startup. Base widget will provide us with some of the Web AppBuilder specific lifecycle functions that we can use, like on open, on close. And those are, again, functions that will automatically get called, that we can put our own code in, that will get called by Web AppBuilder at certain times. So base widget, in addition to those lifecycle methods that I was just talking about, gives you app properties. It gives you the app's config through this.config. It gives you access to the map object through this.map. It gives you state, events, and so on. So you have access to a lot of stuff, and that's the idea that Web AppBuilder brings to your development process. And so you can focus on your job as the developer to build all these events and things together into your UI with your business logic and your workflows, and maybe defining out the widget settings, and of course making sure your UI is properly translated through localization if you need that. The structure of Web AppBuilder is quite opinionated, which is another way of saying that Web AppBuilder expects certain files to be in certain places. This saves you from wasting time having to set up complex configuration files. All widgets must have a manifest.json file, which tells Web AppBuilder about your widget. And it must have a widget.js file, which is the main entry point that Web AppBuilder will use to call your widget. Everything else up here is optional. Widget.html is the HTML template. Config.json can store some settings of your widget if you'd like. There are folders for NLS, which are translations, CSS for your styles, images, and so on. The setting folder is special. It's where you can define out the logic and template for your widget setting modal, which is just kind of an example one is shown right here. It's almost like a mini widget in itself. It's where you build the user interface for your users who are actually creating apps to be able to configure your widget that you're creating. So you'll have a JavaScript file, an HTML template file, and just like custom widgets, you can have localization and translation. So now that I've told you a little bit about widget development, let's create an actual widget. So today we'll be creating a widget that searches the Flickr API to find photos near an address that you type in. We can start out a new widget using a variety of methods, either creating the files from scratch, which sounds like a lot of work to me, copying an existing widget and modifying it, or even using a widget generator, which simplifies the process of creating a blank widget for you. And if you'd like, just a quick plug there, if you'd like more information on that widget generator process, we're going to talk about that in the Web App Builder for ArcGIS Advanced Development Tools and Techniques talk on Thursday. But for today, we'll go ahead and start with a sample widget. And, I need to close my Teams. So I've already got Web App Builder running here, and I've created a simple app. And we want to create a simple widget. And we'll start by, like I said, going into the Web App Builder files. So those are here. Let me magnify it a little bit. So here are the Web App Builder files. When you download Web App Builder from developers.arcgis.com and unzip the zip file, you'll get something like this. And I think most of us in here have probably run Web App Builder already. To get to the widgets repository, you'll go into this client folder, and we'll go into the STEM app folder since we're working with a 2D app, and then we click this widgets folder. And here is a list of all of the out-of-the-box widgets, and it actually has all the code for each of these widgets, which, as a side note, is a really good resource for you to learn about widget development if you want to say, well, how does the draw widget work? You can just go in here and take a look at how that code works. But today we'll go to one of these, a special folder in here. It's called sample widgets. And in this folder, we have a variety of example or sample widgets that come with Web App Builder that you can use to kind of start with or see how certain things work. So today we'll start with this simple widget, which is basically a bare bones widget that has the minimum amount of stuff there. I'm going to create a copy of this folder by just pasting it in place. And I'm going to rename my widget in 2 locations. In both locations, it has to be exactly the same. So in the first location is just going to be this folder name. So I'm going to call our widget Flickr. And then I'm going to go into that folder and open up the manifest.json file. In the manifest.json file, we want to make sure that that the name is the exact same name as the name we just used on our folder. Can you all see the code in the back? Are we good? Yep, okay. So in here, I'm also going to name that Flickr. This manifest.json file has all the settings or all the metadata for our widget, so you can set the rest of these properties if you'd like. So you can put in your name, you can put in the description of what your widget wants to be, and this properties section is really important, and we'll come back to that later. But for now, I'm just going to change the name and save it. I'm going to go back to my Windows Explorer and go to that folder, the Flickr folder that I just created, and I'm just going to move it up a level into the proper widgets folder. That's all I really have to do to enable this widget. So if I go over to my Web App Builder that's running, and I go into the Builder interface, and if I go into the widgets panel and go to add a new widget, we'll see that my Flickr widget is already listed there. So that's really all I needed to do to get going on my custom widget. Of course, this custom widget is not really doing much right now. It's just a copy of this simple widget, which just has some text in it and a single button. But at least we're kind of on the right track to creating our custom widget. Now actually developing this custom widget, we don't want to actually use this builder interface to develop, because when you're creating your custom widget and you're creating your app, it actually, behind the scenes, is copying your widget to different places. And so for actual development, we want to use this paradigm of the web app viewer, where we can send in a config file as a file path into the query parameter, and that's kind of what we'll do today to do development. So to get that all set up, I'm going to go back into my Web App Builder files where I just was, and I'll go up to the STEM app folder, And with Web AppBuilder, a sample config comes along with it. So I'm going to go into the sample configs file and just copy this JSON file into the configs file. So pretty simple again, just copying that file from the sample configs into this config folder. I'm also going to rename it to just config.json, and I'll open it up. This, like I mentioned, is a JSON representation of an app. And so all of the settings for an app, including the web map ID that we're using, are in here. So to view the app that this config file is based on, I'm going to go to my browser, and instead of having the default Web AppBuilder URL, which is what opened automatically when I ran the startup.bat, I'm going to change this to /webappviewer. And then I'm going to add a query parameter, $config equals, and then the path to where I have my config file. So I stored it in the configs folder, and I called it config.json. So let me zoom in a little bit on that. So that's kind of the path. And this is all documented on the Web AppBuilder documentation pages. But yeah, so that's kind of how you do it. When I run that, it's going to open up the Web AppBuilder viewer, and it's going to use my app based on that JSON file that I had open. So to set up my development environment, I want to update the web map ID that my app is based on. So I'll grab that. And I want to update the widgets. So if you saw in the app, we've got 5 widgets at the top right. Instead of those 5 widgets, I want to load my own widget. So I'm going to delete the last 4 widgets. And now we've got just a single widget that's being loaded. I'm going to change it to load mine. We've got the name here, and then the URI is actually the path to the widget. So it's going to be in the widgets folder. We called our widget Flickr, and then /widget is just a reference to the widget.js file. So after I save all that and refresh, we'll see it's now using our proper web map, and then in the top right-hand corner, I can see my Flickr widget is being loaded. And the most important part about this is that I know that it's loading my Flickr widget specifically from the STEM app widgets folder. And this is where I'll do all my development from. So at this point, I can actually go ahead and go into my STEM app widgets folder, and I should have my Flickr file in here. Well, actually, I'll just drag it. So I'll just drag my Flickr folder into here, and now I've got it open for development. I can make a slight modification here just to maybe add some exclamation points just to make sure to prove to myself that when I make a change to the code, I'm going to see that change in the app. And there we have those exclamation points. So at this point, I'm kind of good to go to do some real development. I've got my development environment all set up. So the next few steps, we're going to get into doing some actual development. So I first want to add an icon, which is kind of one of those minor things, but I've got this book icon up here, and it's not the proper thing. So I want to actually just grab an icon here and override it in the images folder. It's just always going to be named icon.png, and it's just going to be a simple PNG that Web AppBuilder will load automatically. So now when I refresh, I've got my proper Flickr icon up there, and we're good to go there. Taking a look at our widget.js file. Again, this is the widget.js file that we got from that sample widget. We've got a template string in line here in the JavaScript file. And so that's going to be the first thing I'm going to change. Instead of having my HTML template in line, I want to separate that out into a separate HTML file to keep things kind of separated and modular. To do that, I need to tell Web AppBuilder that I want to use a template file. And to do that, I go to my manifest.json file. That's where we're getting to what I mentioned earlier, these properties. The property that we want to enable here is has_UI file. And when I set this to true, that's telling Web AppBuilder to, instead of getting my template from the JavaScript file, go ahead and look for a file called widget.html. So I have to create that, obviously. I'll create widget.html, and let's go ahead and move that HTML over. I'll just copy and paste it here. So if I've done everything right, nothing should really change, but I actually want to make sure things are changing, so I'm going to add make a small change to this HTML, and I can actually totally remove this template string variable from my JavaScript file. Now when I reload the page, I should see those minor changes that I made to the widget, those dashes, and there we go. So that's our first step, kind of completed. Next, I want to add some translations, and you might be saying, why do we need to add translations? I don't even need to translate my widget. Well, there's two ideas there. One is that you might want to translate it later, and it's much easier to set up the translations now than having to go back and do it after the fact. But number two, even if you're never going to translate your widget, it's just good practice to have all the static strings that your widget are using in one place. So I'd recommend to do this on all your widgets. To do that, we're going to go into our manifest.json file again, and for the hasLocale property, I'm going to set that to true. Similar to before, when I set this to true, that's telling Web AppBuilder to go ahead and look for a translation. And in this case, it's going to be a folder called NLS. So I'll create that NLS folder. And within the NLS folder, it's looking for a file called strings.js. Now in here, we're just going to put a list of variables and then the strings that Web AppBuilder is going to automatically insert into our widget for us. To get that structure, you can get it on the documentation pages, but I've also got it here. So just for speed, I'm going to grab this over here. And we've got, so you'll see it's a kind of JavaScript JSON-based structure with a variable. In this case, we've got a description and then a string. So we need to use this description actually in our HTML. To do that, you use this kind of token syntax with the $sign and then curly bracket, and you say NLS dot and then whatever name you gave it in your strings.js file. So because I've set up that setting in my manifest.json file, Web AppBuilder will automatically replace that token that I have in my HTML file with the proper translated string. So in this case, it says, please search for a location. Now to do proper translations, you also go to that strings.js file and you just add a locale string and say that it's true for every language that you want to support. So in this case, we're supporting Spanish, which is ES, the locale string ES, and we just say true. Web AppBuilder is automatically going to look for a folder with that same locale string within your NLS folder. So I'll create that new folder called ES, and within that ES folder, I'll create another strings.js. This strings.js is going to be very similar to the previous one, but instead of the list of languages that we support, it's only going to store the variables. And here's the translated string. We can actually test this with a variety of methods. You can either change the locale setting of your browser, or you can add ampersand locale equals ES onto the end of your URL. And that's going to automatically test it as if this browser was in the Spanish locale. And we can see that my widget is automatically being translated by Web AppBuilder. Sorry, that's probably pretty small. I'll zoom in a little bit. So that's how to do translations. Next, let's add some CSS. With Web AppBuilder widgets, you want to make sure you're always properly scoping your CSS. So this is a page of, you don't know how many widgets are going to be in your application. So you want to make sure your styles, if you say, hey, my text color is going to be red in my widget, that you're not accidentally making the text color of some other widget red. And to do that, we call that scoping your CSS. The first step to scope your CSS is to make sure you add a base class. Web AppBuilder supports this through a simple variable called base class, and you can give it whatever you want. We'll call ours Flickr search. And when I do this, Web AppBuilder is automatically going to wrap my widget code in a class, an HTML class for Flickr search. And then I'd simply use this string before all of my styles that I implement. For Web AppBuilder to automatically load my styles, I need to go to, can anyone guess it? Manifest.json, yep. Has style, yep. So I'm going to set that to true. And since I set that to true, Web AppBuilder is going to look for my styles in a particular location. Specifically, it's going to look for a new folder called CSS. And it's going to look for a file called style.css. And then in here is where we want to scope all our styles. So I'm going to start every single one of my CSS rules with .flickr search. And I need to maybe make a class called title. And I'll make my text bold. So font weight bold. Font size. And make the size a little bit bigger too. So like 18 pixels. So now I'm working on a div with the class title. So let me go into my HTML file and actually wrap my description in a div with the class of title. And so after I do this, in our widget, we'll now have those styles being applied. And because I've properly scoped my CSS rules, I know that those styles are only being applied in my widget. So I'm good to go. I'm being a good citizen of my web app. One of the great things about moving on next to past CSS, one of the great things about developing with Web AppBuilder is that since it's built on the ArcGIS API for JavaScript, you can utilize widgets that are available in that API. And it's kind of confusing. People get confused with Web AppBuilder widgets versus JavaScript API widgets. They both kind of use the word widgets, but in the JavaScript API, it has widgets itself. In fact, it has a location search widget that we're going to use today. Out of the box, it does geocoding, it has autocomplete wired up, and we want our users to be able to search a location, so it makes sense for us just to utilize that. So to utilize that, we need to add a div where we're going to put that search box into. So I'll say div data dojo attach point is going to be, and then we're going to give it a name like search node. And this data dojo attach point might seem like a weird syntax, but that's basically the dojo way to name a DOM node. So in my JavaScript, I can use this .search node now pretty much anywhere I want to use that. So now in our widget.js, we're going to load the search widget from the JS API. That's going to be Esri/digit/search. And we'll name it search. And so you don't have to watch me type out a bunch of code. I'll copy this in. So we're going to use, there's a lot happening in this code, even though I didn't add too much. The first thing is that we're using one of those lifecycle methods that I mentioned earlier, in this case, post-create. Post-create is going to be run when the widget is created. And so this code is automatically going to get run. We're creating a new instance of the search widget from the JavaScript API, and we're passing it our map. This .map, if you remember from what I mentioned earlier, is provided by Web AppBuilder because we're extending from base widget. So this .map is a reference to the JavaScript API map object. We're also giving it our search node, which you'll remember I just named using data dojo attach point, and then we're starting it up. I think that's all I need to do to get it working. Let's refresh the page here. And we've got our search, and maybe I can search Palm Springs. And it's auto-completing using the Esri geocoder, and it even zooms in the map. So that's a ton of functionality that we got just by leaning on the ArcGIS API for JavaScript. So I highly encourage you all to do that in your own widgets as well. So let's actually add the Flickr search. So after someone does a search, we want to find some photos near that location. Well, to do that, we need to allow the storing of our Flickr API key. And the Web AppBuilder settings or config file is a perfect way to do that. So to enable the usage of the config file, I'm going to go to our manifest.json file, enable has config. And when I enable this, Web AppBuilder is automatically going to look for a file called config.json at the top level of my widget. This is going to be just a JSON object, and it can be as many key value pairs as you want. So I'll call mine API key, and then you can set a value. These are values that will be able to be set through the settings panel later, but for now we're just going to set it manually for our development. So there's my Flickr API key. No one steal that. Honor system here. So that's there, and now that's going to be automatically loaded into my widget on this.config. So I can now utilize that, and similar to before, I'm not going to type in all this code, so let me copy a couple files here. So I've got this file called flickr.js. Flickr.js is kind of an API module that will allow us to use the Flickr API a little bit easier. And then we're also going to add a block of code to do our Flickr search. So in our widget.js file, when the widget is started up, we want to create a new instance of this, this Flickr module, and we need to include it at the top. So I've included our Flickr module, which I'm not even really going to show this. I mean, here's the code, and you guys will be able to see the code, but you don't have to worry about it too much. Just assume that there's a bunch of code that helps us with making API calls to Flickr. So when the widget is started up, we'll create a new instance of the Flickr module, and here is the key that we're passing this.config.api key, and that's getting it from that config.json file. Then when we do a search, when we get a result, we're going to call this show images function, and I'll just copy this in here. The show images function is going to take the point of the location that the person searched for, and it's going to call our Flickr module, calling the get images function, passing that point, and then it's just going to get back all those images and loop through all the images and show them inside our widget. You don't have to worry too much about this code. It's just basically grabbing all the images and putting them into our widget. So now I think that's all I need to do. Let's try it out. Oh, yeah, I did forget one thing.
One more function.
So in our HTML location, we need to create a place where to put the images into. So I'm going to do a similar thing to before, data dojo attach point. And I'm going to name it image node. So back here in our code, just pointing this out, here's the image node.append. So we're utilizing that data dojo attach point thing again to place the images into this div. So now I think it should work when we try it out. Search Palm Springs. It's going to take that location that we just searched for, hit the Flickr API, and now we've got a bunch of images that are near this location. I won't scroll up again. So it's basically working, and that's very great. But we're all GIS developers here. All these images have an actual location, and how can we see that? Well, maybe we might want to maybe add a hover on each of these images to show the actual location of that. So how would we do that? Let's add in some JavaScript. First thing we want to do is add add graphic to our includes. So Esri /graphic. This is going to allow us to place a graphic into the map when we hover over the photo. And then in our code, we'll add a new function called show image on map, which is actually going to, So this function is going to take in a point and get the photo location for a particular photo, create a new graphic using the JavaScript API. We should all be familiar with that. Passing the geometry, obviously, and then a symbol. And then we're just adding it to we're clearing out the map graphics. So the previous one is going to be hidden, and then we add our graphic to the map graphics. We'll add a reference to this function right here. We'll say when our image is hovered over on mouse over, we'll call our function. And so now I can search for any location. And when I maybe zoom in, I do not know where I searched, but Palm Springs. So now when I search, I've got all these photos, and I can actually see where they were taken as I hover over. We can see that area popping over. Great. So now we've got a widget working pretty well. Just a couple more things we want to do. We want to add our settings page so that instead of having to go into this config.json file manually and add our API key, we want the person who's adding our widget to our app to be able to set their own API key. To do that, we use the settings functionality. So in our manifest.json, our last property that we haven't touched today has setting page. I'm going to set that to true. And because I've set that to true, Web AppBuilder is going to look for a folder called setting. And in the interest of time, I'm just going to go ahead and copy that over. So now we've got this setting folder. And like I said earlier, it's really like a mini widget. So we've got our setting.html, which is going to be a label and then just a text input, a setting.js, which is going to, instead of extend from base widget, it extends from base widget setting. And it basically has two functions that are important. Set config, which basically takes the config JSON file that's stored and populates the form. And then get config is basically the reverse. It will, when the person clicks save, it'll call Web AppBuilder will call get config, which will grab all the values from the form and return back our JSON, which Web AppBuilder will then save as the config JSON. To test this, obviously we can't be in our test application here, so I'll switch back to the builder interface. And let me say, remove our previous version, refresh. And now, when I go to my widget, and I add my Flickr widget, we'll see that we actually have a settings page, unlike we did before. We can save that our API key. Maybe if you put in a value here, we can double check to make sure when we go into modify this, there it's been saved. So that's kind of how the settings page works. And the very last thing we wanted to do is touch on feature actions. Feature actions are just what they sound like when you actually click on a point in the map. You have this ability to do some actions based on that feature that you clicked on. It's under this little three dot drop down, and the default ones for Web AppBuilder are kind of pan to or add to marker. There's kind of generic things that everyone might want to do. But your widget can actually add a feature action to this drop down. And so I wanted to show how to do that. The first thing, like is a very common theme today, is we're going to go to our manifest.json to enable it. This time we're actually going to add some code to the manifest.json. We're going to add a property called feature actions. And that feature actions is going to be an array of objects, each object representing a feature action that your Web AppBuilder widget is supporting. It's going to be a name, and then a URI is going to be the actual name of the file that Web AppBuilder is going to run for this feature action. So I'll go ahead and create a new file just with that same name of my URI. And then the feature action code, I'm going to grab that. So here's what a feature action code looks like, and I'm kind of running out of time here, so I'm just going to talk through it, but similar to the settings, there's two important functions. Is feature supported gets called by Web AppBuilder automatically to see if it should add your feature action to that dropdown. So basically our code here is just saying if it's a point, we want our feature action to be shown, and on execute is what gets called when someone clicks on your feature action. In this case, the code that we're running is just using Widget Manager to first open our widget, and then after that happens, we're calling the show images function, which if you remember from our JavaScript, actually is what, calls the Flickr API and shows all the images. So we really aren't having a ton of code. We don't have to write a ton of code in order to support this feature action. So now when I reload, when I click on any of these points, I should now have a drop-down, which I see I have in my feature action, but it says undefined. That's because I forgot to add the name of my feature action to the NLS. The NLS translation files is where we need to get our feature action name from. So I'll add that here. The format of this is basically just underscore feature action underscore and then the name of your feature action. So in our case, we called it get images, and we can call it whatever we want. The nice thing about it being in the NLS is that you can obviously properly translate it for different languages. So now when I reload and click on one of these points, there's our feature action with get images. I can click on it. It's going to open our widget. And of course, Flickr. There's a wholesome list of photos. There we go. So there's our Flickr images. So now we have a really successful, complete widget that has basically all the features that you could possibly add. And now Dave's going to talk about themes.
Okay. All right. So what do we got? So we're going to do rapid learning here, okay? So let's talk about themes. So what is a theme? So theme is you, right? Think of it as your brand of your application, right? The look and feel of that UI. But before, there's four major components in a theme. So let's go through those pretty quickly. So the first is layout. You guess it, so lay out the positions of your widgets, relative to the map in the browser, right? Where everything's placed. How many layouts do you have in a theme? 3 or 4, you can have 2. It's totally up to you. There's always a default. And then you have, that's our layout there, right? So there's positions of widgets, etc. Now we have panels. Panels can be dockable. They can be floatable, right? You can drag them, drop them. Basically, they're a container, right? So, okay. And then next is style. So style is going to be the color scheme of that particular header controller. It could be the CSS, etc., that makes up that characteristics of those different. And then what we have is our controller. Think of that as the master brainchild of how your app behaves, right? So you have like Dart controllers, header controllers, and basically houses the container of those widgets. So think of app behavior, okay? But to better understand what makes up the Web UI, it's probably good to give you a good illustration. Is so we basically inherit Dojo digits, right? Dojo digits become ArcGIS API for widgets. And then we have our GMU classes, which are basically GMU widgets, and then we have the Web UI, right? But to look at this in a layer approach, right, going from bottom to top, we have Dojo digits, right, that we bring in to the ArcGIS API for JavaScript, which we inherit Esri.css. Then we override that with GMU.css, and then every theme can overwrite the bottom, okay? So you can really get stylistic on and doing these different type of themes. Okay, so then you have comparing like a functional widget versus a controller widget. The purpose of the controller widget is to display app information, behavior, how it interacts in workflows. The functional widget, like with Gavin's, was basically one specific functionality of the app. Perform Flickr search, show me image. Folder structures, very similar. It's the same folder structure with widgets and themes too. And basically when you're doing a controller widget, you do is in controller widget equals true, if not false for a functional widget. Is a theme widget true? Because you have controller widgets that are part of different themes. Then in panel, it's always false, right? Because your controller widget's not going to be in a panel. And then functional widget, they can vary, right? Can be in panel or not, okay? And then, so let's create a new theme pretty quickly, because I know we're short on time. Okay, so here we have a custom theme, and basically I have this config.theme JSON. I'm not going to go through the folder structure, but basically what Gavin did, same way. Manifest, name your theme. The name of the folder's got to match the name of the theme. The name of your string's got to match the name of your theme as well. Other you'll get unable to load error on that, okay? So we have a custom theme, so we're going to go through it pretty quickly, and and import some CSS. Okay, so we have a master CSS that overrides all the theme of our CSS. So I have this CSS that's called Dev Summit theme, right? And the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to import a font, and we're going to import a font from Google, and it's basically we're going to override the GMU main font and declare it a font family. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to do an override, right? And then we're basically going to say, hey, for this layer list section title, give it a font family of that. And with light labels on layer row names, we're going to override that, okay? So that's going to encompass everything, and our styles is going to look for that CSS. It's going to use an Ubuntu font. Okay, so the next thing that we're going to do is we want to edit a particular style CSS, because we can have different styles. As you know, with Web App Builder, you can have one default, you can have many different. So the next thing that we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and set the font to that Dev Summit theme CSS. So we're going to do an import that Dev Summit theme. Next thing we're going to do is we're going to override the GMU main. So we're going to say, hey, GMU background, give me white, right? And then next thing we're going to do is we're going to do the GMU title, right? All right, okay. And then if we just hit Control Save real quick and we go back to our theme, you're going to see some stuff that doesn't make sense because now it's all white. Our icons are hidden here, right? So we got to account for that. We have this weird divider here. This doesn't look too good here. So we can change those characteristics, right? It's simply just modifying some CSS. Okay, so the next thing that we're going to do is we're going to do we're going to do GMU zoom. So I have all code snippets in here. And basically what we're writing is we're overriding the default color scheme and opacity for the home button in these widgets that are on screen, okay? The next thing we're going to do is we're going to do GMU header. And then basically, here's where our work is done. We're overriding the title pop-up pane to match our colors. We're overriding the GMU panel title. And here's some ways to change the backgrounds on our fonts when the pop-up icon nodes. And then we're going to change the color of our header controller drop-down. So if we consolidate widgets to 14 pixels, and then we change our drop-down menu, etc. Right? So if we hit search, save, we go back here, we load. You're going to notice now we be able to handle this. It matches our theme. Now the last thing we can do is we're going to override some CSS to change this search here. Okay, so we're just going to go back into our CSS, and we're going to do. Remember, we inherit all those widgets from Dojo. So basically we can go in here and change the search button to a padding of 6 pixels, no border. Over on hover and focus, we want a background color of white, we want a font color of blue, and then our input is blue with 14 pixels and there's no border, right? So if we go back into our widget here, we refresh, here's our widget, matches that, it's more blended into it, right? So now if I go into Web App Builder, and let's create a new theme here, and let's call this famous testing here, right? So we're going to create a theme, and one of the questions I got today is, can you export templates? Of course you can. You just need to house those on your web server. So now I have this icon for Dev Summit 3 for Dev Summit theme that I didn't show, but here's our theme right here, and as you can see here, I got many different styles here that they're already pre-wired, but it's basically this style blue. And let's say I want to save this and export it as a template. I can give certain app parameters, which is just basically JSON, to save that template out to my org. And I've had to export to my organization or my local server, right? Let's see, we can just call this testing Dev Summit. Anyone who grabs this theme can use a web map into that theme. Now it's exported to my org here. And next time someone calls a web map, right, as long as it's on a hosted web server somewhere, they can embed their web map into my theme, okay? So that's another way you can export templates, all right? Okay, so community, you want me to just go through the community?
Sure.
Yeah, okay. So how do we be successful with it, right? We always don't know the answers to all the questions. So one thing that we always like to try and push is our doc, right? So we have great documentation. We're constantly improving it. That includes online help for our documentation. That's for online ArcGIS Online. And then we have our developer edition with it. And then we have a very top 5 popular group called Web AppBuilder and ArcGIS GeoNet. Very responsive, you get your questions answered. So if you're asking questions regarding that, people in the community are willing to help. And a lot of people are building widgets that they're sharing, which is even better. Because if you're 80% there, it's better than 0% there, right? So if people are building stuff, reuse it, recode it, and give it your own style. Other online resources. So we have our solution teams builds these particular vertical solutions that are on widgets, and they put those on GitHub. Other list of widgets are codesharing.arcgis.com, and then Esri GitHub.io, Web AppBuilder custom widgets. And then we're going to consolidate our code, and then we're going to share with you the theme and widgets that we built today on GitHub, and you guys can pull that information and have fun with it, and just look how the syntax works and stuff like that. So for those who didn't go to the session earlier, we wanted to share with you what's coming, just give you a little bit of info here. It's this thing called Experience Builder, okay? And basically what Experience Builder is, it's going to be a new GUI builder to configure web apps and web pages, okay? As you know, Web App Builder is very map-centric, right? Map's always the focal point. Experience Builder, you could be web apps and web pages. So it's all going to be based on React, right? That's what we're building the GUI interface with, React. It has an extensible framework for creating widgets and templates. It's going to be on all our 4X API. Of course, it's going to target a couple different personas, developers to create web apps and etc. Designers, if you're creating UI to create themes. It's going to be much more simpler, more drag and drop type. Solutions developers to build any kind of solution app templates. And then of course, domain experts of alike to build these. Your question? No? Okay. So here's some key features. So it's going to be mobile friendly. Same web app or web page on a mobile can be configured separately from the desktop. It's going to have integrated 2D and 3D. As you know, right now, when you create Web App Builder, you have to create 2 instances of applications. It's going to be all integrated. You could switch between the map view and scene view directly in the app. And then more importantly, you're going to be able to analyze your web apps and web pages to build a complete picture of user statistics. You got to know what your app purpose is and actually look at statistics, how people are using your app. And then lastly, as well as you got to have an extensible framework, right, for all developers to create widgets and templates, right? We're not getting rid of Web App Builder. They're going to release, right? We're going to have both of them. And to give you a little idea of what the release plan is, we're going to have a beta release. See the yellow font in the bottom? Subject to change, okay? So beta release. I'm going to say June-ish, UC time, I'm believing. And then we're going to have so that's ArcGIS Align and the Developer Edition, okay? And then fourth quarter, December, I'm going out on a limb here. I'm going to think that we're going to have final, right? So we'll have something fully released for you. And then those for you who are using Enterprise, pretty early 2020, right? So look out for that. It's pretty cool. I don't know if you guys have seen it before, but it's pretty cool. It's if you just want to create like web pages and web apps, and it takes a lot of, and you're still going to have widget development and stuff, but the UI is a lot different, and it's based upon React. So look out for that. And with that, we wanted to open up to questions. And what we always strive for is we hope you learned something new. And if you didn't, we didn't do a good job. But what we always want is we always want honest assessment on the surveys, because we need to get a raise. So if you guys get us good scores, no, just give us honest feedback, because we're always tweaking this presentation. Next year it'll be Experience Builder, but and with Web App Builder. But hey, thank you for coming. I know it's late. You're probably hungry. You're hangry, but thank you. We appreciate your time coming out here. And if you guys have questions,
thanks so much.
Feel free. Thank you.